so we're on video number 3, and hopefully my filming skills have improved since 1 and 2, although to be fair, they couldn't really get much worse than that, right? And this time I have a tripod, so my phone isn't going to fall like the 2 times it did in the last video, so that is good. Okay, so for today's video, you won't really need your map or battle sheet because we're not really going to put any battles in today, so you can take a break from that for this lecture. This one's going to be the shorter one because this is our Wednesday homework lecture. Awesome. All right, so Civil War Day 3. Where did we leave off on Day 2? I think, if I remember correctly, that we left off with the Battle of Antietam. So as we said, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, the bloodiest battle to be fought on American soil up till that point, and I think in all of history. And the Battle of Antietam, as we talked about a little bit, was a turning point in the war. So why was it a turning point? Is what we're going to talk about today and what that meant for the war. Okay, so first and foremost, it was kind of an obvious reason. It's because it was technically, what we know was technically a draw, but we also know the Confederates had to retreat. So when the Confederates retreated, that was kind of seen as an informal victory for the Union Army. So it was a much-needed boost of morale, is our first reason. Morale goes up for the Union Army. So let's do that. Union morale goes up as a result of the Battle of Antietam, because this is the first time they're actually seeing the Confederates retreat from them, like that, in the Eastern Front. So that's the first reason. Second reason, it destroyed any hope at all that the Confederates were going to be able to make an alliance with any European country. Because at this point, it's very clear that no side at this point has the upper hand, and Europe doesn't want to be involved unless they know for sure that one side is winning over the other. So any European support, so something from Great Britain or France, is gone at this point. So they're pretty confident that it's just going to be an American war. So no outside forces. And then finally, this supposed or sort of Confederate defeat gives Lincoln an opportunity to do something he'd been thinking about for a while now. And today is when we're going to talk about what that something Lincoln had been thinking about is. Alright, so I'll just put third. Lincoln's idea. Give you guys a second. Okay, so let's think back to the very beginning of the war. When Lincoln had just been elected president and when he gave his first inaugural address. I think you have the handout for the inaugural address, and I'm going to assign that for you guys to read over the weekend. But what you need to know is that what he said in his inaugural address was that he wasn't going to do anything about slavery. He didn't want to do anything about slavery during his presidency. And you remember we talked in class a couple weeks ago about how the South didn't believe him, about how the South thought that even as he was saying, I'm not going to touch slavery, the South was spreading rumors that he was going to free all the slaves anyway. And as the war went on, Lincoln's views actually started to change in that direction. He started to think twice about his approach to slavery and decided that maybe he was kind of naive to think that he could get through this entire presidency without addressing slavery. For him, though, addressing slavery at this point wasn't a moral obligation. It wasn't a moral situation. It was a military strategy. So it's not about morals at this point. It's a military strategy. But how can we turn slavery into a military strategy? Well, the way Lincoln was looking at slavery is that he wasn't necessarily looking to end slavery everywhere. That's not what he thought he could do. He was looking to end slavery only in the South, only in the Confederate States. So what's the point of only freeing slaves in the Confederate States? Why can't he just free them in the entire country? Well, there are a couple reasons for that. So let's kind of give a little example, kind of a little unrelated history example to kind of give an idea of why Lincoln thought it might be a good idea or it might be a necessary idea to end slavery just in the South. So here's our example. Imagine you have a younger sister, or a younger sibling of any kind. For our example, it's going to be a younger sister. Some of you probably do. Some of them might have your younger siblings running around with you as you watch this video. So for our purposes, you have a younger sister. And your little sister wants to watch television longer than she's allowed to. And of course your mother says no. So your little sister gets really upset and says she's going to run away somewhere where people aren't so mean to her. So she picks up the family iPad, or whatever she has to play games on, runs out to the back porch, and sits there and plays games because she's mad. So now what's your mother going to do about the situation? Well, anyone here with younger siblings has probably seen or experienced something like this before. So there are a few things that a parent will do in a situation like this. Usually the first thing you do is wait a few seconds to let the angry child calm down. So that's probably what's going to happen first. Wait a few minutes. Let kind of the air clear a little bit. And I mean, it's okay to do that, right? Because at this point your sister is only on the back porch. Like, she's still within the house. She's just moved somewhere else because she feels like she's being treated unfairly. So keep that in mind. So your mother waits a few minutes, and then, only then, she tells your sister, come back inside. She tells her that she can keep playing games on the iPad, but she just wants her to come back in the house at this point. At this point, she's willing to not even think about the argument about the television anymore. Just come back inside, play on the iPad, and just, do what I'm telling you to do. But now your sister is so mad that she's convinced that even if she comes back inside, that your mom's going to take away the iPad, even though she's just said she won't. So she won't come in. So now your mom gets angry, and she tells your sister that not only does she have to come in right now, that from now on there won't be any iPad games allowed. So that's the example. And this might be a silly example, but let me ask you this. Why in the example did the mother take away the iPad when the argument was actually about the television? Why did the iPad become what we took away? Well, the answer is fairly simple. It's because the sister in the example wouldn't listen. The mother had to do something else, take away something else to get her attention and show her that she was serious. Because the sister in the example misbehaved, she lost additional privileges that weren't necessarily related to what the argument was about to begin with. And this is exactly what Lincoln is trying to do as he deals with the situation in the South. So I'll give you a second if you have any questions on that before we explain that, and we have to make sure the camera's filming. It is in fact filming, so we're all good. All right, so how does this iPad television example relate at all to what Lincoln is doing with slavery? Well, if we remember what Lincoln said publicly, he had no personal intentions to abolish slavery. Left to his own purposes, he wouldn't even have addressed the topic. And then the war begins. And if you remember in the beginning, there wasn't really a strong reaction to the South seceding. Lincoln thought they were bluffing. The president at the time, Buchanan, didn't even do anything. So they gave them their moment to kind of settle down, calm down, and come back to the Union on their own terms. But that didn't work, because we know then Fort Sumter happened. So then we have smaller battles like Sumter. Kind of skirmishes. I don't even think anybody died at Sumter. So Lincoln tries other methods. He tries small battles like Sumter, and then they progress to bigger battles like Shiloh and Antietam. At this point, they've lost so many lives, and Lincoln doesn't see that this is going to be settled easily, and he thinks that at this point we kind of need to try other things to try and end the war, try other strategies, try other ways to prove to the South that the Union, the North, is serious, that they need to come back to the Union. So he's going to take away one of the privileges, aka slavery, which he hadn't intended to, but because it's gotten out of hand, he feels like he needs to take that extra step. So, in 1862, he takes the first step in this process by declaring all runaway slaves who made it to the Union Army were to be declared forever free. So if a slave ran away from the South, came and joined the Union Army, they were free forever, no matter what. So that's step one. And by the end of 1862, he was convinced that the only way to save the Union was through an Emancipation Proclamation that would free more slaves, take away that privilege to the South. But he hesitated in releasing this proclamation. And why might he have hesitated? He was waiting for a Union victory. Why might a Union victory have been important for him to release this proclamation? For Lincoln, it was important that the Union had a victory before he made this proclamation, because he didn't want to look desperate. He didn't want the Emancipation Proclamation to look like a last resort option for a president who was losing a war. He wanted it to look like an addition to a victory that they were already winning. So while Antietam wasn't exactly a victory, if you know from your sheet, Antietam should be down as a draw, because one side retreats, but there wasn't any clear victory. However, because the Confederates retreated from Antietam, that was enough for Lincoln to consider that at least some sort of victory. So, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issues something called the preliminary document, the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So what do we mean by preliminary? Think of preliminary document as a warning. So in our silly example about the sister and the mother, think of it as the mother yelling, if you don't come in right now, I'm going to take away your iPad. The Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln's warning to the South, in which he says, very clearly, unless they stop fighting, return to the Union, all the slaves in the states under Confederate control would be freed, effective as of January 1st. So he gives them an ultimatum. And they don't pay attention and they don't listen. So that's why, on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into immediate effect. What it does is free all the slaves in the Confederate States. What it does not do is free any slaves in the Union States. Let's put that up here. Emancipation Proclamation. Frees all the states in the Confederate States, does not free the states in the Union States. Because remember, Lincoln's seeing the Emancipation Proclamation as an act of war. It's not a declaration of racial equality or human dignity, although it's come to be regarded as that now, and perhaps Lincoln regards it as that later in his life, but at this point, it's a move, it's a strategy move. Because at this point, Lincoln doesn't believe, and actually he continues to believe this, that the Constitution doesn't actually allow him to end slavery. Because you're thinking of slaves as property, the Constitution doesn't allow you to take someone else's property from them. He believed in popular sovereignty. Do you remember what popular sovereignty is? Give you a second to think about that. If you don't, it's okay. We talked about it a lot when we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Popular sovereignty was something that Stephen Douglas was kind of a proponent of as well, where popular sovereignty allows the states to decide for themselves whether or not they have slavery or not. Lincoln didn't feel like it was his job as president to make that decision for the states. However, as an act of war, he made it for the states in the South. The Constitution actually has to change before slavery can end, and that'll happen in 1864 when the 13th Amendment is ratified. But until then, slavery is still technically legal. Lincoln has just freed all the states in the South as an act of war. So this is Lincoln's military move. It's the first kind of move he makes that's not to do with soldiers and fighting. So what's the result? What happens after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect? It actually happens, or actually goes exactly how Lincoln wants it to. So first, foremost, and most obviously, you get a lot of very quick and very emotional reactions definitely from the South, but especially from the North as well. People in the North actually said he was being unconstitutional even by doing this, even though he was trying very hard to stay within the Constitution, technically speaking. People still claimed he was being unconstitutional and were unhappy. And actually thousands and thousands of Union soldiers end up deserting the Union Army because they claimed they didn't sign up to go to war to free slaves. They signed up to preserve the Union. So you actually get deserters from the North because of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then you have the Democrats. So Lincoln's political rivals, remember Lincoln was one of the early members of the new Republican Party. The Democrats end up winning lots of seats in the House and Congress in the next election, because so many people are mad at the Republicans because they support Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So these are kind of the ways the North reacts. But these are minor disagreements in comparison with how bad it is down south. Obviously, the Southern plantation owners want to keep their slaves from finding out about the Emancipation Proclamation, but it eventually makes its way through the grapevine. And as soon as word gets down to the South that the slaves have been freed by President Lincoln, plantations, cities, everywhere just goes into a complete state of confusion, because hundreds and thousands of slaves finally feel they have the governmental support to rise up and run away from their masters. And they start immediately trying to make their way to the North, many of them actually to join the Union Army. So even though we have Union soldiers who desert because of the proclamation, we have newly freed slaves that join instead and take their place. And also, even though this was a piece of military strategy and not necessarily a moral decision, the moral reputation of the North goes up, especially in Europe, because Europe has already freed their slaves. Great Britain has already freed their slaves, and to them slavery was a moral issue. So when they see the North, or when they see the United States kind of following suit, or at least President Lincoln doing that, they suddenly support the North morally as well. And abolitionists in the North now feel a stronger pull towards the war cause than they did before, because it's now become about freeing slaves. So what exactly did the Emancipation Proclamation accomplish? It doesn't stop the war immediately. It's only 1863. The war is going to go on for another 2 years until 1865. But what it did do was change the purpose and trajectory of the war, kind of change the mindset that surrounded the fighting. Because up till now, I've kind of been pushing this idea, Lincoln had been pushing this idea, that slavery wasn't a big part of why they were fighting the war. Whether he was in denial or whether he was right or wrong, history kind of debates that. But that has been his position throughout the war. But now he's kind of receded from that idea and has decided that he needs to make slavery an active part of the war. So next class, for next video, we're going to look at what the war looks like following this kind of repurposing, this kind of redesigning of the war's trajectory, and kind of drive that towards the end of the war and the results. All right, so that is all for today. I will see you on Thursday to answer any questions, take the quiz, and then next week in our next video. Bye.